Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at a reading from Upfront Scholastic, The COVID Economy. For this part of the lesson, you're asked to answer the key concept questions that coincide with the reading. So please listen carefully to the following presentation that'll read the excerpt for you. And remember that you can replay any part of this presentation for detail, clarity, or repetition later on. Let's go ahead and get started. The COVID Economy. The pandemic has changed our world in ways that may reverberate for a long time to come. Here are just some of the ways that is true. Number 1. How we work. The rise of remote work and the decline of the office. The pandemic has revolutionized the way Americans work. For decades, the accepted model for how white-collar workers did their jobs was that they gathered in offices where they could go to meetings and the boss could keep an eye on them. The pandemic, economic experts say, has shattered that model. According to a Pew Research Center poll of workers whose jobs can be done remotely, only 20% of them were working from home all or most of the time before the pandemic. But by December 2020, 71% were working remotely. Twitter and Facebook are among the companies that now say that they'll let their employees work from home permanently. Whatever reluctance there was to embrace working from home before, a big chunk of people who are doing it now are going to continue to do it, says Robert Wright, a former U.S. Labor Secretary who is now an economics professor at the University of California, Berkeley. That is a huge economic implication for downtown districts where office buildings tend to be clustered and for commercial real estate. Companies will need less office space if a significant number of their employees are working from home. The coffee places where all those workers grabbed lattes, the delis where they got sandwiches, and the bars where they gathered after work will face a new challenge if their regular customers are working from home instead. There are other possible ripple effects too. Wessel predicts that we'll see a big decline in business travel. Having been forced to rely on Zoom for the past year, many companies have figured out that it's unnecessary and inefficient to fly employees across the country to attend a 3-hour meeting. That may be a huge savings for many businesses, but it will be an enormous loss for others, including the airline industry, which depends on high-priced business class tickets, and hotels, which depend on business travelers. Number 2. Explosion in online shopping. The acceleration of existing trend away from brick-and-mortar stores. Online shopping has seen incredible growth during the pandemic. Americans spent more than $861 billion buying things online in 2020, up a whopping 44% over the previous year. According to Digital Commerce 360, that's the biggest annual jump in online shopping in at least 2 decades. What's happened is that a whole new group of consumers discovered that online shopping is convenient for things they used to think were easier to buy in person. According to a recent survey by Top Data, 73% of people say they're shopping more online than they did pre-COVID, and 88% that say that they'll continue to do so when the pandemic is over. This is just accelerating a well-established trend. Many malls and mom-and-pop stores were already struggling before the pandemic, as customers embrace the ease of online shopping. Some analysts see a silver lining, though, for brick-and-mortar stores. After so many months of being cooped up in our houses, Americans may be overjoyed to pursue books in person or try on jeans before buying them. But the immediate future looks tough. More than 12,000 stores closed in 2020, according to Business Insider, and those empty storefronts will have a big impact for years. Once you shutter these places, it takes a long time for them to come back, says Jeffrey Wenger, an economist at RAND, a public policy think tank. It will change how your city and town feels. Number 3. The importance of essential workers, the people who keep America functioning. While many white-collar workers have been able to work from the safety of their homes during the pandemic, that wasn't possible for a huge chunk of workers who deliver our packages, bag our groceries, clean our hospitals, drive our buses, pick up our trash, and do hundreds of other essential jobs that keep our society functioning. There's been an outpouring of appreciation and support for essential workers, says Molly Kinder, who studies low-wage workers at the Brookings Institution. I think the word essential is such a positive one. It denotes that these workers have value and we cannot exist without them. But this newfound appreciation is starting to translate into increased support for raising the minimum wage. The federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour hasn't increased since 2009, and there's been a big push in the past year to raise it gradually to $15 an hour by 2025. Surveys show that more Americans, about 7 out of 10, now support raising the minimum wage than before the pandemic. President Biden says he favors raising the minimum wage up to $15 an hour, but many small businesses say they can't afford to pay their employees that much without cutting jobs, and many Republican lawmakers have opposed a mandatory increase. There's also been renewed interest in unionizing. Workplaces such as meatpacking plants have been COVID superspreaders, and more workers are realizing that unions would enable them to band together to demand better protections. Amazon, for example, is facing the most serious unionization effort in its history from warehouse workers in Alabama. Amazon has argued that unions won't benefit their employees. But Americans' growing support for low-wage workers has to do with our increased awareness of who these people are, Kinder says, and what their lives are like. A lot of them are people who are trying to raise a family, she says. Number 4, where we live. The rise of rural America? Traditionally, cities and metropolitan areas around them have been the main engines of our national economy. That's where most of the jobs have existed, so that's where most of us had to live. The pandemic has upended the calculus. Not only has COVID raised some people's anxiety about living in densely packed cities, but the growing acceptance of remote work means that many white-collar workers have new options. There have always been places that were desirable to live, but from which you could not earn a living, says Kathleen Hall Jamieson, director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. But now those are places where you can earn a living. This creates opportunities for the nation's rural areas, which have been traditionally economically left behind. Since the start of the pandemic, there's been a jump in home sales in rural communities and an increase in the number of kids enrolled in rural school districts, according to Matt Dunn at the Center for Rural Innovation. While this may open the door for new growth in rural America, economists insist that we shouldn't count cities out. Cities may look different in the future, but Richard Florida, a professor of urban studies at the University of Toronto, predicted that fear will subside and cities will come roaring back. The clustering of ideas and talent in cities, Florida says, is way more powerful force than any infectious disease. Number 5, relying on global supply chains. A new push for Made in America? For the past few decades, the U.S. economy has been more and more globalized, meaning that fewer products are made in the U.S. because it's cheaper to make them elsewhere and import them. Even products that are still manufactured here depend heavily on materials and components from other countries. There have been benefits to this. All those cheap products available at superstores and clothing retailers wouldn't be possible without workers in foreign countries who are paid a lot less than Americans. But the pandemic has also revealed the dangers of this approach. The early days of the pandemic were marked by shortages of many critical products. It turned out that most of the protective gear that the healthcare workers use to keep themselves safe is made in China. So finding adequate supplies of medical-grade masks, gowns, gloves was suddenly impossible. There's been a recognition that if you rely too much on supply chains that are long ago in China, we may find ourselves in a bad place if we need something in a hurry, Wessel explains. Experts believe this will encourage the U.S. government to subsidize more goods made in America. We weren't manufacturing the things we needed to keep ourselves safe, says Jamieson of Annenberg Center. We're going to be producing more things in the United States. That's going to be a push to produce things that are essential here. And number 6, a new era of big reform, the possibility of major policy changes. There's a saying in Washington that big crises create big opportunities. Many public policy experts are now hoping that the public health and economic disaster of the past year prompts a new openness to consider reforms. I think economic shocks often lead to rethinking of the status quo, Wenger says. You clearly saw that during the Great Depression. Once the pandemic exposed the fragility of the system, then all the systems became open for debate. That's essentially what happened in the 1930s when President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal in response to the Great Depression happened. With 25% of the country unemployed and lines of desperate people waiting for food handouts, Americans were willing to try a radical new approach. The New Deal created, among other things, the country's first unemployment insurance system, protections for workers, and a major public works program to give jobs to out-of-work Americans. Might the country be poised for a similar policy rethink now? We've gone through a trauma as a society, says Reich, the former labor secretary. When you do that, everyone is much more willing to consider reforms. But he cautions, we're not likely to see the kind of massive structural reforms that took place during the Depression. Unlike 1933, we still have a very divided country. Reich explains, with FDR, the whole country was behind him on doing something quite dramatic. We don't have any political consensus behind what needs to be done now. Americans are sharply divided, for example, on whether the government should provide health care to all Americans, as many nations do, and to what extent the government should offer economic assistance to the people in society who need it most. These kinds of disagreements could limit the extent of any changes, but there's no doubt that the pandemic will at least get people taking seriously or talking seriously about them. This is a chance for the country to have a bigger discussion about what is in its future and what it's going to look like in the next 50 years, says Jamieson. In some ways, it's really exciting. So that leads us to ask these questions about what a president's role is in fixing America and guiding us through a pandemic. Think about, of course, both President Trump and President Biden in their action on the pandemic and what lies ahead. This reading serves as a nice guide to understand more about the future and what it holds, as executive leadership may or may not help or hinder our ability to survive and thrive during these trying times. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with completing the rest of the lesson.